A few years ago, I preached a sermon called Good Sex. Oh, yes, I did. The sermon signboard caused quite a bit of a stir that week. Many of you will remember that we received a phone call from a passerby who thought we had been pranked. But that was really the title. It was a sermon about religiously liberal sexual ethics. Good sex, as in ethical sex. Today's message about the Me Too movement ties in with that one. In fact, I could have probably called this sermon Bad Sex, but I wasn't sure anybody'd show up. And anyway, I wasn't sure I wanted to sign my name under that one on the signboard out there. But the Me Too movement is about bad, as in unethical, behavior having to do with sexuality. It's about sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. That is something I know many of us in this room have experienced. And for many, the unfolding of the Me Too movement has been painful. Therapists have reported that between the election of a president who bragged about sexual assault and the unfolding of story after story about sexual abuse in the media, they saw an increase in patients with PTSD symptoms. Today, the goal is not to relive those things. I'm not going to be giving any graphic descriptions of assault. But I am going to be talking in general terms, especially about the concept of consent. So, if anybody finds that they need to step out for a while, you just go right ahead and do that. Take care. Let us also recognize that while Me Too has made plain a big trend described almost entirely in male and female terms, there are many people of non-binary gender identities whose lives have also been impacted by the same kinds of dynamics. And finally, although it's just come to most of our attention, the Me Too movement dates back quite a bit further than last year. It was started in 2007 by Tarana Burke, the founder of Just Be Incorporated, a nonprofit that helps victims of sexual harassment and assault. Ms. Burke remembered an encounter she'd had with a 13-year-old girl in the 1990s, in which the girl told her about sexual abuse that she'd experienced, and Burke just found herself speechless. I didn't have a response or a way to help her in that moment, Burke says, and I couldn't even say, me too. Later, she started a movement with the name Me Too in order to marshal the resources and the support she wishes she'd had. Last year, after assault and harassment accusations against Harvey Weinstein were made public, the actress Alyssa Milano also wanted to give voice to sexual abuse victims. She posted on Twitter, "If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. And it ignited on social media. Within 24 hours, the hashtag had been posted 12 million times just on Facebook, just that one platform. Before we move on, let it be acknowledged that Tarana Burke is Black and Alyssa Milano is white. Tarana Burke is not famous, and Alyssa Milano is, but of course, white women are more likely to be made television stars than Black women. After Alyssa's tweet set off a cultural torrent, many Black women activists noted that it's typical that white women are heard while Black women are brushed off. Within a couple of days, when she learned of Tarana Burke, Alyssa Milano gave Burke credit, and she also reached out to her. But later, when Time magazine named the women of the Me Too movement as Person of the Year, they did not include Tarana Burke on that cover photo with the group, a glaring omission. Tarana Burke says she's glad the Me Too movement has grown. She knew what we all can now see, that a lot of women have Me Too stories. And you know what? Me too. During my middle school and high school years, I experienced groping, harassment, and so-called slut-shaming in school. My name was scrawled on the boys' bathroom stall. I was stalked by a fellow student, and on numerous occasions was followed by strange men in downtown Portland. When I took a temporary job doing data entry at my mother's workplace, Her boss, a man my grandfather's age that she privately referred to as Attila the Hutt, groped me. I was 15. These are my tamer stories. It went on and on, easing up only when I transformed my image from teenage girl to mother at 19, a role I dove 110% into, wearing turtlenecks and ankle-length skirts under the baby sling, partly because I wanted to be safe. I was not safe. I share this knowing I might receive some criticism for that. That's what's been happening when women share their Me Too stories. They're criticized. But I also share it knowing it really doesn't stand out that much. Of all the women I've ever described this stuff to, none has been particularly surprised. A majority have similar stories. When I've shared it with men, some have been shocked. Some have responded with empathy. And others, and a few women too, have responded with questions along the lines of what I could have done better to prevent a lot of that. Here's the thing about that. Women think about sexual harassment and assault prevention every day. We avoid being alone outside in the dark. We look over our shoulders when we walk alone in unpopulated places. We keep our keys in our hands and we look under our cars in parking lots and we lock the doors as soon as we get in. We play out self-defense and escape scenarios in our minds. We think about whether we can run in our shoes, and we only meet new male acquaintances in public spaces. We walk side routes to avoid being harassed on the main drag. We avoid eye contact, avoid initiating conversations, take the stairs instead of the elevator, cross the street to avoid a man who looks potentially aggressive. We answer fake phone calls to avoid interacting, or we pretend we're walking with the nearest other person or group. When, not if, a strange man is overly familiar with us, we may pretend that we're about to meet someone, or we try to politely extricate ourselves because we or someone we know has experienced a man who went quickly from flirting to rage and became dangerous. Some men feel encouraged by that politeness and they refuse to let the conversation end. Some men would never dream of becoming dangerous, but a woman cannot know that. She only knows she feels trapped in the conversation. And the younger a woman is, the more of these things she does. Ladies, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Do you do some of these things? Let me hear you say, me too. If you've ever arrived home alone at night and checked your closets for an intruder, can I get a me too? Right? Me too. And the odds of someone being in our closets is vanishingly small. Right? Vanishingly small. But that's the mindset a person develops when they're repeatedly exposed to a threat. That's a traumatic mindset that gets set in. In our workplaces, it gets more challenging. Somehow we have to be pleasant enough in the face of inappropriate behavior not to get fired or ostracized, but we also have to be careful not to seem to like it or encourage it, which could invite more of it or worse, and that's a tough needle to thread. In one-on-one relationships where some trust has already been established, it could be trickiest of all. In one really common pattern, a man elicits a woman's sympathy. Maybe he's sad or lonely. Maybe he has been rejected in the past. Maybe his behavior is not the worst of the worst. It's just a little off in the gray area. He may be such a pitiful case, she finds herself unable to assign much value to her own discomfort as he ignores her boundaries. And at the end of the day, she feels violated and angry and strangely guilty at the same time. Her too. It's a subtle but common storyline that has been told and retold in this last year. So when we ask what a particular woman might have done to prevent a Me Too kind of situation, not only are we ignoring the likelihood that she's already been practicing prevention every day of her post-pubescent life, we're also implicitly normalizing sexual harassment, assault, and abuse. What do I mean by implicitly normalizing? Sounds like an academic term, right? I mean we're acting as though the woman's behavior and not the abuse itself were the most remarkable thing. right? Instead of focusing on the poor and outrageous behavior of those men that are involved, we focus on a woman's responsibility to deal with it, as though it were unstoppable. But that's just not true. It's so hard to talk about these things, right? Women don't agree on how to do it. We don't all agree on it or on what constitutes abuse. There's certainly significant generational divides about it. Many men instantly feel attacked or hurt when the issue comes up. They're afraid of being lumped together with the worst behaving men. Other people worry about due process, and some of the loudest voices these days are sounding the alarms about potentially false accusations. What if a nice man is taken down by a false accusation? And it's true that that would be awful and unjust. It's also true that statistically speaking, today, a man is more likely to be the victim of sexual abuse himself than to be the victim of a false accusation. So, a conversation about ending abuse and harassment serves everybody. And if we spend too much time down in those weeds of which cases were abusive and which men are responsible and to what degree, then probably we're going to be missing that larger picture, right? Me Too is about seeing the big picture and changing the undeniable dynamics that create it. The power of the Me Too movement is that it keeps us from losing the forest for the trees. When so many women speak out at the same time, it's impossible to ignore that large pattern. It's so hard, so fraught to talk about, but as the writer Jessica Valenti says, the truth is that this is what optimism looks like. This is what optimism looks like. Naming what's happening to us, telling the truth about it, as ugly and as uncomfortable as it can be, means that we want it to change, that we know it's not inevitable. I believe in boys and men. I love them as a minister, as a fellow human, as the mother of one, the mother of a young adult that I brought into this world and I've adored since he weighed 7.5 pounds. I love men, and I know so many, especially here, who strive to be kind and egalitarian. Another thing I know for sure is that what's happening now is bad for women and for men. We've been hearing the phrase toxic masculinity lately in the media. And it's not a very perfect phrase, I think, because it kind of makes it sound like masculinity itself is toxic. Masculinity reflects a deep and valuable aspect of our humanness, and it's to be cherished along with femininity. But toxic masculinity refers to something else. It refers to this ideal of masculinity that's active in our culture today, one that is harmful and incomplete. It's toxic for the person who's trying to embody it and for the people around them. It's a masculinity that's obsessed with power and conquest, with dominance and the suppression of emotions. In order to have a conquest mindset, a man has to kind of dehumanize the other, the person that he would conquer. He has to think of that person as deserving of the conquering. And since conquering implies that the other person is likely to resist in some way, he has to not care how that person feels. He has to shut down empathy and believe that that person is not like him. Because, in this context, those others are typically women, in this process, men also cut themselves off from that part of themselves that's associated with femininity, like tenderness and vulnerability and caring. Otherwise, the woman would be like them, and that would mess the conquering mindset up. This interplay, this dance, costs men dearly. The psychologist Niobe Way conducted a study on men and friendship, and she discovered that American men are disproportionately, chronically lonely. Many American men have no close friends with whom they can share their authentic selves. This is due to many factors, but a significant one, she says, is that the toxic ideal of masculinity does not allow for it. How does a man develop close ties with another man if he has to suppress his feelings of love and affection? How does he be authentic if he hates and hides any part of himself that might be construed as feminine A lack of meaningful friendships is correlated with mental and physical illness and with premature death. An analysis of nearly 150 studies suggests that spending time building and nurturing your friendships may be just as important to your health as eating right and exercising. Toxic masculinity touches the lives of gentler men. It makes them the targets of bullies, right? It seeps into our subconscious when we speak of boys trying to get some and girls giving it up. That's conquest language. It shows up when men objectify women in inappropriate contexts, like commenting on bodies on the street or school or the workplace. I've talked with some men who were genuinely perplexed that women aren't flattered by this when the comments are positive, which they often are not. And there are definitely times and places when any one of us, male, female, or non-binary, wants to know that another person finds us physically attractive, right? But focusing on women's bodies in the wrong context can feel threatening and undermine other kinds of relationships like professional ones. Does this mean that we're putting an end to flirting? Well, God, I hope not, right? Flirting is affirming, it's energizing and fun when it's mutual and in an appropriate context. When it doesn't come out of nowhere and land like a grenade, right? Then it's fun. The toxic kind of masculinity, because it's so pervasive, it touches all of us. And so it's also true that kind men, and really people of all genders, also have some learning to do. And that's okay. Having some learning to do does not make anybody a bad person. We all have learning to do. The spiritually grounded approach to the learning that we have to do is one of openness and curiosity. The humility to say, there may still be some things that I don't know. What is being asked of kind men right now? It's the same thing that's being asked of all men. To let women speak without interrupting or defending. Not right now. Let women speak. And believe them when they describe their experiences. They're taking a chance if they're telling you. They know that telling these stories can lead to being blamed or criticized or just silenced. Men are being asked to refuse to participate in normalizing bad behavior. Call your brothers out when it is reasonably safe to do so. Safe, not comfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. Men are being asked to understand and practice meaningful consent. Everybody needs to practice meaningful consent, but in the context of Me Too, right now we're especially addressing our beloved men who partner with women. There are many situations in which, although mutual consent might be apparent, clear, meaningful consent is actually not possible. For example, between a boss and an employee, or a successful professional with lots of connections and a person who's desperate to launch their career. Meaningful consent is also not possible between someone who is alert and a very intoxicated person, between an adult and a minor. It's not possible in a relationship in which one person threatens to withhold their love or leave or become sullen or angry if the other won't agree to their sexual requests. Meaningful consent means being mindful of whether another person is vulnerable physically, psychologically, or emotionally in their life or in a particular moment. An ethic of meaningful consent means we have to pay attention not just to the person, but to the context we're in with that person. We have to pay attention to unequal power, and we have to pay attention to the power of roles and what others need from us. For example, priests, ministers, counselors, and doctors cannot have sexual relationships with any person they serve in those roles, because those roles come with power and a set of expectations, and to cross that boundary is to violate a relationship in a harmful way. Meaningful consent also means getting affirmative consent. A woman's body is not a silent yes until she explicitly says no, right? It's a silent no until she explicitly says yes. That's a shift. A woman's body is not a silent yes until she explicitly says no. It's a silent no until she says yes. Meaningful consent means sometimes taking no for an answer. It means it's not okay to repeatedly put a woman in the position of saying no again and again, whether it's about going on a date or having sex. It's not okay for a man to try to wear a woman down to change her mind. That's that conquest mentality. I've got one more thing to say, and then I'm going to wrap up. It's that sexual harassment, abuse, and assault happen in churches too. Happens on church staffs, happens between ministers and members, and it happens from one member to another. And here at First Unitarian, we speak very openly about those things. We have clear policies for preventing and, if necessary, for responding to that kind of behavior, including behavior that seems to fall in those gray areas. So if you ever observe or experience something here, I really hope you'll tell one of us ministers or a member of the Healthy Community Committee or the board, because we take that very, very seriously. The questions and the stories of the Me Too movement are tough, but this is worthy work. We're having a learning moment together as a country, a change moment, and that causes some anxiety. It intersects with other issues like race and privilege. It shines a light on a lot of unfinished work in our country, on who gets to speak and who gets to be heard, and that can be overwhelming. But as we learn, as our perception expands and we see more clearly, it opens a door to healing, to wholeness, to friendships and health, and restoring right relationship. A time for loving and for being loved. This is the deep work of being human together in community. Will you rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn?